Good morning, everybody. Welcome. We're delighted to have you here, and I'm going to be very rushed in this introduction. It'll be an unfair introduction to Secretary Higginbottom because she's got a very tight time constraint, and it would be wasting your time for you to listen to me. But I did want to just say a word of welcome to all of you. Special thanks to Ambassador Shin and his delegation. This is the first time that the NAPSI conference has been held outside of Seoul, and we're very to be asked here in Washington, and delighted to be able to bring this impressive delegation, and I think it's because of that Secretary Higginbottom was able to find time in her very pressed calendar to be able to join us today. I have a very soft spot in my heart because she's the Deputy Secretary of State responsible for resource management. That's what I used to do over at the Defense Department, and us number twos, we have to hang together, okay? And she's an enormously talented person, having come from taking that role of being the Chief of Staff for the Office of Management and Budget. A lady who has excelled in managing resources, and she's doing that now for the Department of State. And would you please welcome her with your applause to get us started?
Thank you so much. Good morning to all of you. It is really a pleasure to be here this morning and to have the opportunity to kick off this important forum for Northeast Asia regional cooperation. As Secretary Kerry said just last week when he was talking about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we are committed, the United States is committed to reinforcing our long-standing bonds with our allies in this region. We are tied together by geography, by our shared values, by interconnected economies, and by our decades-long security alliances. And we share diplomatic goals, both regional and global, goals that we are working to advance here today. So I want to thank Dr. Hamre and CSIS for the continued thoughtful reflection on the region, as well as those the whole team here that is hosting this conference in this beautiful, beautiful building. And a special thanks as well to Mr. Shin and the Korean National Diplomatic Academy for your leadership. I know that the two previous conferences, as Dr. Hamre just noted, were very productive and not held here. And it's a real honor to be kicking that off here today in Washington with such an impressive group of experts and practitioners. And I'm confident that this two-day conference and the surrounding events will be just as productive. And that these recommendations can lead us to shared actions that can increase trust that is needed to tackle critical political and security challenges. In parallel to today's forum, the United States government is delighted to co-host this year's high-level intergovernmental Northeast Asia Peace and Cooperation Initiative meeting with the Republic of Korea later today. And this is the first time that this will be held outside of Korea. When President Obama hosted President Park in March, he said, "We share common values and a common vision for the future of the Asia-Pacific, a vision that is rooted in our strong commitment to a rules-based order, one in which all countries, regardless of size, act according to shared norms and shared principles." President Park acted on that vision when she launched this initiative to foster constructive regional collaboration, to move beyond what she called the Asia paradox, where the economies of the region are increasingly interdependent, but unfortunately, political and security cooperation lag behind. We welcome the initiative's approach. Dialogue leads to shared action, fosters a common vision, and ultimately results in deepened trust and increased regional security. We are fortunate to have two accomplished diplomats from our respective countries leading this effort. As I'm sure you know, Deputy Minister Kim is a highly respected official who has dedicated his career to strengthening multilateral relations, including efforts to build trust and decrease tensions across Northeast Asia. And President Obama designated Deputy Assistant Secretary Sung Kim to spearhead our involvement. Ambassador Kim is also our special representative for North Korea policy and has previously served as the special envoy for the six-party talks and as the U.S. ambassador to the Republic of Korea. So he has spent extensive time wrestling with some of the region's toughest issues. The United States' participation in this initiative is part of our broader commitment to the security and stability of the region. And let me be clear, we remain steadfast in our defense commitments to the Republic of Korea and Japan, and to the security of the Korean Peninsula. To name just one example of our ongoing collaboration, our defense ministers met in June on the margins of the Shangri-La Dialogue. They discussed common objectives on the North Korea threat, the regional security situation, and trilateral defense cooperation. North Korea's September 9th nuclear test was a jarring reminder of just how important our shared work is to maintain the security of the Korean Peninsula. We must keep up sustained, focused, and comprehensive pressure on North Korea. And that's why Secretary Kerry met with Republic of Korea Foreign Minister Yoon and Japanese Foreign Minister Kishida last month to discuss our close coordination in the wake of North Korea's provocations. With partners in the United Nations Security Council, we are working to impose the toughest sanctions yet on North Korea. We are also working through bodies for regional cooperation, such as the East Asia Summit, APEC, and the ASEAN Regional Forum to maintain a united front as we call on North Korea to end these provocations and choose a more peaceful path. But our interests and collaborations in Asia extend beyond North Korea and beyond security. Under President Obama's rebalance, we are reaching out to partners who share our vision of a peaceful, prosperous, and open Asia-Pacific region. We are working together on women's empowerment, global health security. We are working together on ocean conservation. We view the Northeast Asia Peace and Cooperation Initiative as a precursor to much broader coordination on a host of issues. Just look at how the world mobilized in the wake of the November 2014 announcement from China and the United States regarding our shared commitment to address climate change. The United States government and many of our Asian partners share a strong tradition of linking practitioners with experts outside of government, from think tanks to universities to the private sector, to help us solve some of the world's biggest challenges. The topics that you'll discuss today and tomorrow are vital to the security and to our security and the security of the region, and I thank you for lending your time and your expertise. Your recommendations can help build a habitat of cooperation, laying the foundation for constructive regional collaboration on tough security challenges. This initiative's partners represent a large portion of the world's economy and population. What we say and do in unison matters, and there should be no limits on what we can accomplish together. So thank you so much for having me here this morning, and I wish you really the best for productive discussions and look forward to continuing our work together. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Higginbottom, President Hamre. My name is Victor Cha. I'm the Senior Advisor and Korea Chair here at CSIS, and I too want to welcome you all to the third annual NAPSI Forum. CSIS is very honored to have been asked to host this forum the first time it has been held outside of Korea. My role this morning is to introduce the President of the Institute of Foreign Affairs and National Security and the Korean National Diplomatic Academy, Ambassador Shin Dong-ik. Previously, he was Deputy Minister for Multilateral and Global Affairs at the Foreign Ministry and has pursued a diplomatic career since 1981, serving as Ambassador and Deputy Perm Representative to the United Nations in New York, Director General for International Organizations, Minister Counselor at the Korean Mission to the UN, Advisor to the United Nations Foundation, and a number of other posts in Geneva, Kuala Lumpur, and in the United States. He holds 2 Masters of Arts degrees in International Relations from University of Pennsylvania and from Yonsei University, and received his BA from Yonsei University as well. It's our pleasure to welcome Ambassador Shin to CSIS this morning.
Thank you for your kind introduction, and good morning, everyone. He's not here. Anyway, John Hamre, President of the CSIS, and Ms. Heather Higginbottom, Deputy Secretary of State for Management and Resources, Professor Victor Cha, and distinguished participants. Please allow me to extend my warmest welcome and sincere gratitude to all distinguished participants who have taken their valuable time to join us for the 2016 Northeast Asia Peace and Cooperation Forum. It is particularly my pleasure for the Institute of Foreign Affairs and National Security at the Korean National Diplomacy Academy, called KNDA, to co-host this year's forum in Washington, D.C., together with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. As you know well, to promote regional dialogue of Northeast Asia Peace and Cooperation Initiative, we call as NAPC, the Northeast Asia Peace and Cooperation Forum was launched in 2014 as an intellectual venue in which policy practitioners and scholars and experts from across the world gathered together to discuss pressing issues for regional cooperation in many soft security areas. In the past two meetings held in Seoul in 2014 and 2015, participants were engaged in intense discussions and brought up specific policy recommendations to facilitate multilateral dialogue and cooperation in the region. In parallel with the forum, high-level intergovernmental meetings, as kind of track one meetings, were also held twice to facilitate multilateral cooperation in the subject areas, and the third meeting will be held this afternoon. In this sense, we believe that the Northeast Asia Peace and Cooperation Forum is a genuine embodiment of multi-track and public-private partnership at the regional level in Northeast Asia. Following guiding principles of NAPC, such as a gradual and step-by-step approach, complementing with other existing cooperative mechanisms, an open and flexible approach, NAPC so far has modest progress in the past 3 years. The first, NAPC gained support from international community, from around 30 countries and 8 multilateral organizations, including the United Nations and European Union, and OSCE too. Second, as I mentioned already, there is steady progress in Track 1 consultations in parallel with Track 2 meetings since 2014, holding regular meetings including today's forum. In addition, focal points for Track 1 meeting were officially designated in all NAPC countries except North Korea. Third, NAPC laid out foundation for cooperation in soft security areas such as nuclear safety, energy security, disaster management, public health, cyberspace, cooperation, environment, and drugs and narcotics. Fourth, in order to learn valuable experiences of existing regional cooperation mechanisms, Korea has been hosting various joint workshops with the OSCE, NATO, EU, and ASEAN. Likewise, we will continue to explore cooperation with other multilateral regional mechanisms such as Northeast Asia Cooperation Dialogue, NEACD, Northeast Asia Peace and Security Management, NEA-PSM, and Ulaanbaatar Dialogue. A positive news in the region is the improvement of trilateral cooperation among Korea, Japan, and China in initial awarded CJK meeting, holding its 6th trilateral summit in Seoul, October 2015, and 8th Foreign Ministers meeting in Tokyo last August. Such trilateral diplomacy, or triplomacy, that's a newly invented word by Dr. Cha, will help countries in Northeast Asia expedite its cooperation in the framework of NAPC. However, somebody says the NAPC is in trouble because of recent complicated situations in the region. It is true that there are pressing challenges which hamper smooth development of NAPC, but it is also part of process of ups and downs, the business as usual process, and gradually building trust among countries in the region. The first, the North Korean nuclear problem is the most clear and present threat to establishing peace and cooperation in the region. Kim Jong-un regime's continued provocations remain unabated, as demonstrated by nuclear tests, most recently first test on January 6th and fifth one September 9th, together with various types of the missile launch including SLBM in this year. Responding to the threats, international community has been imposing the toughest sanctions against North Korea through both Security Council resolution, for example, Resolution 2270, an additional resolution is being negotiated against North Korea's fifth nuclear test in the Security Council, and individual autonomous sanction measures are being imposed against North Korea too. By many countries, United States and European Union and Korea, Japan, and others. The international community has serious concern that North Korea's nuclear capability, if left unaddressed, might soon be a game changer, disrupting peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula and the whole world. Second, rising tension and diverging interest between major powers have been getting serious surrounding disputes in the East and South China Sea. Also, China and Russia oppose U.S. Army's THAAD deployment in South Korea. We believe it is a countermeasure to defend South Korean people as a right, self-right defense, and responding to North Korea's consistent provocation, including nuclear and missile tests. Third, under such unfavorable environments to regional cooperation, trust building in Northeast Asia requires sustainable, long-term commitments of countries in the region. In addition, political wills and sense of ownership on specific agenda by member countries are really demanded. As we repeatedly stress, NAPC is a process-oriented and long-term strategy to establish an institutional mechanism of multilateral cooperation in the region. As we still have a long way to go forward and probably envisage NAPC even in the process of peaceful reunification of two Koreas, it requires patience and persistence. In this regard, I would like to suggest a couple of points to be considered for the development of NAPC in our way toward regional trust building. The first, I cannot emphasize too much the importance of nourishing inclusive identities in Northeast Asia. Our history is full of conflicts, violence, and wars that originate fundamentally from exclusive identities, whether they are religious, ethnic, ideological, or national. Asia is no exception to this. The history questions that has long strained relations between the countries of the region remains unchanged. The agony of the collective national memories of the modern Northeast Asian history since the 19th century has been continually rekindled in the form of retrospective and reactive nationalism. A common Asian identity to be shared by the people across the region seems to be unrealistic at this moment, due in large part to the ongoing geopolitical competition and rivalry, as well as to the historical collective memories. It is thus necessary to nourish inclusive as opposed to exclusive identities that embrace otherness and recognition of plurality of our identities. Second, we need to build and strengthen civilian research networks. As legitimately claimed by Spanish socialist Manuel Castells, as we are now living in network society in which discourses are generated, diffused, internalized, and ultimately embodied in human action. In such a network society, our effort should be thus directed at building and enhancing civilian networks in the region under the rubric of public-private partnership. It is not a hidden secret that groups of scientists in both sides of the Cold War confrontation contribute through their research and policy advice to disarmament and arms control agreements between the United States and the former Soviet Union. The OSCE network think tanks and academic institutions, in which almost 60 institutions from 40 countries take part, conducts research on OSCE security agendas. In this vein, it is auspicious that we can commence establishing public-private think tank networks in the soft security issue areas in February 2015, with the purpose of enabling vibrant common research across Northeast Asia. Third, given the primacy of national security in the region, it is needed to consider expanding the realm and scope of our cooperation networks beyond the current soft security areas, which include traditional security elements. In Europe, the 1975 Helsinki process led the initial military CBMs that include information sharing, prior notification of military activities, and reciprocal attendance of military exercises. Ever since the commencement of the Helsinki process, CBMs in Europe have been continuously enhanced and consolidated to eventually lead to the implementation of high-level CBMs, including the Treaty of Open Skies and Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe, called CFE, and the Forum of Security Cooperation. In this context, I see a particular meaning in that today's forum will discuss on CBMs as an agenda, a breakout session. Fourth, we have to resolve North Korean nuclear issue, which is one of the main causes which destabilized Northeast Asia and the whole world, together with the firm measures, sanction measures to Pyongyang's nuclear provocation, multilateral dialogue, including NAPC, however, is still open to North Korea, only when it shows genuine intention for denuclearization of North Korea. Since the international community, including the United Nations, has condemned North Korea's nuclear test since 2006 and unanimously supports the nuclear-free Korean peninsula, our common and collective efforts to deter North Korea's further provocations are more important than ever. We believe that only consistent and tougher pressure on North Korea will lead the Pyongyang regime, particularly its top leader Kim Jong-un, to change his calculus on the nuclear ambition for its regime's survival and return to the dialogue table for denuclearization. Lastly, NAPC needs firm and consistent commitments from member countries, which are requisite for trust building in Northeast Asia. It also needs the same commitments from successive governments in each country even after their domestic elections. From Korea's perspective, basic concept and all the activities and programs relating NAPC will not be changed and properly utilized for the future governments. In conclusion, as it was explained in the concept note adequately, following the stocking up of solid mass of trust, NAPC will cast a wide net to encompass a broad scope of collaboration. The process certainly needs collaborative and collective action in concert on the multilateral scale, and NAPC is intended to build on epistemic community through such an action in concert. Some experts commented that Korea, as a constructive middle power which is located in the center among major powers in Northeast Asia, is mostly qualified to play a role in actively advancing the regional dialogue and cooperation and narrowing gaps in differing strategic interests among the countries concerned. Against the backdrop, think tanks, like our organizations, whether policy-oriented or academic, are strategically located in the public sphere between the government and people. And as they could make great influence not only upon policymaking, but also upon civil society and the press, think tanks do have crucial catalytic roles in facilitating and realizing trust building in Northeast Asia. Public sphere will develop in the global society through tight-knit human and institutional networks. In this sense, I believe that today's forum is such an expanded public sphere and anticipate we can bring up collective wisdom and expertise that will guide us to act in concert in a journey toward achieving peace and cooperation in Northeast Asia through NAPC. Since this is my only introductory remarks on the current status of NAPC, I have many questions and comments will be discussed in depth in plenary and breakout session. And Deputy Minister Kim Hyung-jin is here. He's representing Korean government who will also share his thoughts and insights on NAPC in detail at today's dinner session. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ambassador Shin. I think we are going to move directly into the first panel session now. Ralph Costa from Pacific Forum CSIS will be chairing this panel. So members of the first panel, if you could please come to the stage, that would be great.
Well, good morning, everyone. Aloha. I'm Ralph Casa from the Pacific Forum CSIS in Honolulu. We're the lucky part of CSIS. We have a very distinguished panel this morning, and we have lots of issues. Ambassador Shin already laid out, I think, some of the important questions that we want to talk about. We've asked the panelists to try to hold their opening introductory remarks to about 5 minutes each, so then we can have time for some crosstalk and interaction among the panelists, and then open it up for Q&A as well. I will break the first rule of moderating and not introduce all of the panel members, since that would take about 15 minutes just to tell you about all these distinguished gentlemen, and they all have their bios in the packet. So instead, I would like to just go ahead and we'll get started in the order that I have folks listed anyway, and ask Kim Sung-han if he would get us started with his comments. Sung-han.
Thank you, Ralph. First of all, I'd like to thank CSIS and Korean Foreign Ministry for giving me this wonderful opportunity to speak to distinguished experts. As Ambassador Shin already pointed out, NAPC, Northeast Asia Peace and Cooperation Initiative, was started with not hard but soft security issues with a view to gradually expanding cooperation to hard security issues. So basic principles for the past 3 years have been well received by all of those participating countries, including United States, Japan, China, Russia, and Mongolia. In addition, the participation level has been also gradually upgraded to more or less assistant or deputy ministerial level. And the NAPC also adopted a chairman summary as other regional meetings. And starting this year, it is being expected that the participating countries will be taking turns in hosting this NAPC forum for the sake of promoting so-called co-ownership among the participating countries. So for the past 3 years, in retrospect, there was a functional cooperation, if not strategic. For example, about nuclear security, CJK TRM, top regulators meeting on nuclear security was there, but in addition to that, TRM Plus was held in September, and November 2014, with the participation of United States, Russia, France, and Canada, which was kind of expanded to include those important countries. Regarding disaster management, the feasibility of cooperation with TCS, the Trilateral Cooperation Secretariat among ROK, China, and Japan, and the relevant NGOs kind of promoted and reaffirmed. And CJK TTX tabletop exercise was held this year on June, together with US, Russia, and Mongolia as observers. So this kind of modest progress has been made. And also, as Ambassador Shin pointed out, kind of a very unique feature of NAPSI is that there is a public-private cooperation network by borrowing the brain pool from the private sector, the distinguished experts. So kind of an international network among experts has been established, has been created, and regular track 2 meetings and joint research programs have been being conducted, which is a very good development. However, there are many challenges remaining. As we are witnessing today, there is kind of exacerbating, deteriorating regional political landscape. In particular, North Korea has recently conducted the 5th nuclear test, which had made a kind of a worsening impact on the strategic environment in Northeast Asia. Initially, as I already emphasized, started with the softer security issues. But NAPSI, it turns out, it has limitations in making progress unless the North Korean nuclear issues discovers kind of a breakthrough. Although NAPSI issues are not expanded to include those tough, hard security cooperation. This means that soft security cooperation can be damaged to some extent by hard security conflicts, which means they are inseparable. Another challenge is kind of an institution fatigue, which might emerge when this kind of gradual process of NAPSI is contrasted with some tangible results of bilateral cooperation or trilateral cooperation. But NAPSI, as you know, provides a kind of a regular and systematic platform for cooperation in Northeast Asia. At the same time, it adds the security dimension to soft security cooperation, and it offers multilateral security cooperation as kind of a public goods in Northeast Asia. However, the largest challenge for NAPSI, yeah, 1 minute, actually 30 seconds, maybe the sustainability of NAPSI over a long period of time. So this is the matter whether NAPSI is being seen as a key diplomatic agenda for Northeast Asian peace and stability by the opinion leaders in and out of Korea. Actually, similar similar initiatives have been proposed by the previous ROK governments since the Kim Young-sam administration. But a gradual kind of initiative like this should not be terminated with a single kind of a government, because it takes some more time than expected, as we have seen in the cases like OSCE and ASEAN. So in this light, the next government needs to continue this kind of initiative and establish that kind of initiative, not just as the Korean diplomatic agenda, but the Northeast Asian agenda, which serves peace and security in this part of the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Ralph. I will certainly abide by the time because Ralph is not just the chair of this panel, he's also on the board at CSIS, so we have to do what he says. So I'm going to finish within 5 minutes for sure. My comments are going to be more from the academic side as a scholar who has looked and watched NAPSI grow over the past 3 years. And to me, what's interesting about it was that, this was really a genuine attempt to try to create a regime for cooperation in Northeast Asia. And it was a concept that has acknowledged what has worked and what has not worked in terms of institutional cooperation in East Asia throughout history, in the sense that it focused, as Kim Sung-han said, it focused on softer security issues. And for the most part, it was less formal in structure. What has worked in Asia in the past have been institutions that are less formal, that are more functional, and in some cases quite ad hoc. And that algorithm in the past has worked when we look at institution building in parts of Asia. And I think so when the NAPSI concept emerged, it acknowledged, I think it was informed by an understanding of that history of institution building. And if there's a theory behind NAPSI or a concept, it is that cooperation on these functional issues or dialogue on these functional issues starts to create habits of consultation, right? Practices of dialogue and meeting and familiarity that can then form the basis of trust building on harder issues in the future. So I think NAPSI was right in that it wasn't trying to take on the really difficult issues first, but taking on but still very important issues. So that we'll be doing today in the afternoon, confidence building measures, nuclear safety, and disaster management. But it's not just those issues. It's issues having to do with health, with pandemics in Asia, coronavirus-related pandemics, climate change, human security, cyber issues. I think these are all quite important issues that don't rise to the level of the issues that have always been obstacles to cooperation among the powers in Northeast Asia. So I think NAPSI deserves a lot of credit for that. But as Minister Kim mentioned, there are dilemmas, and one of the biggest dilemmas I think for NAPSI is that, or this sort of organization, is that you need a country like Korea to create offer like this because in many ways it's non-threatening. Right? I mean, it is a MICTA, right? It's a middle country, a middle power. If one of the big powers in the region tried to come up with this idea, it would immediately create insecurity spirals. So that's very important. On the other hand, the sustainability of these sorts of things, if history gives us the sustainability of these sorts of things does require active participation and subsidizing by the great powers, by the big powers in the region. So that's, I think, the dilemma for NAPSI going forward. Secretary Higginbottom used a term where she said a habitat of cooperation. So how do we sustain this habitat for cooperation in the future? Well, one, I think, is that NAPSI in the future, even though it has been more amorphous and less formal, probably needs a degree of formalization, right? It needs the creation of some institutions, some secretariats, both at the official and Track 2 level in all of the participating countries. Second, it needs the very active support, particularly as we enter a transition period in Korea from the current administration to the next. It needs the active support, proactive support of the United States and China. In the region. If this is to really be an effort that is sustained for the future, it has to have the support of these two countries. Third, I think NAPSI has to own certain issues and maybe even narrow its agenda and integrate that so-called NAPSI agenda with other multilateral gatherings in the region, so that there is a NAPSI agenda at APEC, there is a NAPSI agenda at EAS, there's a NAPSI agenda at a variety of different, and not just Asia-based. As you can see on the panel, we have people from all different multilateral organizations, but NAPSI has to own an agenda, and that might mean narrowing its focus. Thanks. And then last, I think NAPSI has to meet more as a Track 2 grouping and as Track 1. The annual meeting of Track 1 plus Track 2 is good, but for NAPSI to sustain, it needs to have more Track 2 meetings. And those Track 2 meetings also offer a place for North Korea to participate. I mean, there should be, I think, an open invitation for North Korea to participate in NAPSI, difficult as it is at Track 1, maybe less difficult at Track 2. Thanks. Right on time. There you go.
Thank you, Ralph. Good morning, distinguished participants. I would also like to thank KNDA, particularly Ambassador Shin, for involving me. And I wouldn't say involving Japan, but I cannot stop being a Japanese, so I'd like to contribute from my country's perspective. I think in talking about NAPSI, I personally was involved in discussions in the prior stage. In the initial years, Korean delegates visited all related countries, including Japan, and I was part of the first and second dialogues of that kind between South Korea and Japan. But I have to say that the dominant views in Japan are largely negative, if I may be honest, about the feasibility of this initiative. But talking about negative side of this could be easy, but that's not going to help the sort of original purposes of this. So I like to say something different. And in the context of the importance, stressing the importance of Japan-South Korea dyad in this multilateral setting. And I think at least theoretically, if Japan and Korea can move, this could be an icebreaker in many ways. And I'm not saying this because I believe this is going to happen anytime soon easily, but I believe despite those realistic sort of observation, there are potentials, great potentials in making Japan-Korea cooperation as an icebreaker. I don't know whether it's going to be realized during my lifetime, but hopefully during the lifetime of many young people. And I stress young people because of my personal experiences of bringing my students to South Korea every other year. And I just took them 2 weeks ago. And all the time I bring them and observe student exchanges, I notice one very critical assumption behind building trust. Of course, building trust is not easy, but one critical assumption to trust, in my view, is empathy. And I don't have to tell the importance of empathy to students because they practice it naturally. And in discussing difficult issues, for instance, they do not engage in just a unilateral, the arguments of their views of the other side, but rather they start asking questions about the other side. And I think that begins because there is empathy as a natural inclination among young people, which do not necessarily exist at the governmental relationship, unfortunately. But even among government people, one important story that we often hear is in every capital in the world, including Washington, D.C., Japanese and Korean diplomats are the first to become good friends. And many of them testify to that. And I think between diplomats, practitioners at the governmental level, there is some extent of empathy about each side. That's, I think, how, for instance, Korean Foreign Ministry become a target of criticism by advocacy groups in South Korea. And the same is true in Japan. Those engaging in Japan-Korea relationship can easily become targets of somewhat nationalistic challenges from a group of people who do not know what empathy is all about. And Deputy Minister Kim Hyun-jin was here briefly, sitting right next to me. And about 5 or 6 years ago, he visited my office. And there was one thing which told me, which I keep repeating everywhere, including here. That is, in the United Nations, where he had served before visiting me, in the United Nations, when Korean government proposes some agenda, Japanese support is almost for taken granted. And the same is true for the Japanese government. When the Japanese government proposes something in the United Nations, Korean support is almost taken for granted. And that of course, means agenda are very similar between Tokyo and Seoul when it comes to global issues and the kind of issue that NAPSI, I think, is talking about. And this leads me to the final point that I'd like to make, which is about the importance of concluding GSOMIA and AXA between Japan and South Korea. During Lee Myung-bak government, they completed GSOMIA, but couldn't sign it because of well-known reasons. And AXA between the two militaries regarding typical non-traditional security cooperation, including peacekeeping and disaster relief type of activities. They were discussing AXA as well. And I think if Japan and South Korea succeeds in concluding AXA, this is going to be a very beautiful achievement between the two countries. Just imagine Korean and Japanese soldiers working side by side in many parts of the world, engaging in disaster relief activities and peacekeeping activities. And this could be a platform from which to involve Chinese participation, for instance. And this will come to TCS, which Song Han just talked about. And I think these potentials are clearly there between Japan and South Korea. So I think realizing them, I think, should be very important, intellectually and otherwise, and thinking about how to come around obstacles. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Shin and KNDA. I have a 4-point to make, and you'll get my paper in the afternoon. I actually emailed to KNDA 2 weeks ago. First point, I think North Korea has 3 expectations to be being acknowledged as a nuclear state. First expectation is to secure survival and to enhance its national pride. Second expectation is to obtain strategic advantages over the South in both military and the future unification process. Third expectation to use it in counterbalancing the pressure from regional and global powers, winning respect of regional and international communities. I think North Korea is quite successful in achieving these 3 goals. And point number 2, and I think there are 3 challenges ahead, and we have to consider more sanction work, and we'll have to consider more sanction created humanitarian disaster or bring regime crisis or regime change in North Korea. And we have to consider the question, if new collective efforts in sanction failed, what's next? Point number 3, there are 2 main facets of Chinese North Korean policies. China, actually, you can say it's 2 bottom line. Number 1 is China is now ready to abandon their traditional friendship with North Korea. So that's why China proposed 3-step dialogue. First, North and South should reach some kind of a consensus, and then extended that dialogue to have a dialogue between the United States and North Korea. Then the 6-party talks. The key point is North Korea needs some kind of a minimum security guarantee. The second bottom line of China is any change in China's North Korean policy should not be seen as a collective effort with the United States. Rather, China would rather go through a UN system. And the reason is China simply doesn't want to turn itself into a direct enemy or have a direct conflict with North Korea. Number 4, point number 4, and we have to use 3 lenses to look at the continuity and change in China's North Korean policy. The first lens we can use is we can use a microscope to study how China responded in the last 10 years over the 5 tests, nuclear tests and missile launches done by North Korea. I think the general debate in China surrounded more focusing on the 6 issues, whether North Korea is an asset or liability, whether the actual effect of the economic sanction, And some people argue why China should continue to do that with the United States, because of Assad, because of some other issues, And also the debate focusing around the nuclear safety issues, refugee issues, because there's 2 million Chinese, Koreans living in the border area. And if you can calculate, there might be another 1 million refugees if you have a crisis. So the hard issue for China to handle. You see the newspaper, armed robberies happens every year, happens all the time. So there's a headache. And also debates on Chinese investment in North Korea. If you sanction North Korea against North Korea, will Chinese companies be punished? And whether China should still maintain economic ties with North Korea. What's the benefit and cost? And the debates also on the stability and regional balance, whether war is highly likely to break out or what, And actually, I want to make a point that some of these debates actually backfired at sometimes for China's own government and China's North Korean policy. For example, in global times, some people argue China should make some contribution, so must do something to support the idea of surgical strike, decapitation. Some other people says no, China should not be chauvinistic, should not showing the chauvinistic attitude towards North Korea, because the Chinese government says there should be a normal relationship with North Korea. So North Korea does not necessarily to guarantee be responsible to take care of the Chinese security concern. So there are some other debates in China. So the 3 lenses I proposed, number 1, use a macroscope lens, and the second, use wide-angle lens to look at the role the United States and South Korean played, and the third, to use telescope to explore the future solutions. I don't have time. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Sergey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure and honor for me to address this audience and to discuss this important issue of NAPC. As you know, the Asia-Pacific region is one of Russia's foreign policy priorities, and Moscow is very keen and interested to promote initiatives to shape new security architecture in Asia. And as far as NAPC, from the very beginning, Russia supported this initiative because they correspond very well with Russian initiatives, Russian move to the east. And we, in our country, we arranged many bilateral, multilateral conferences devoted to NAPC. And for example, one of them has been in Vladivostok. Then, as you know, there was a so-called NAPC train going all the way from Vladivostok to Berlin, promoting this initiative. So in other words, we were participating in it very actively. But from my standpoint, the largest problem for NAPC, as already been mentioned today, is aggravation of tension at Korean Peninsula. Because you know, what does NAPC? It's about all these pipelines and connected railways and joint space, energy space, transportation space. But if North Korea is isolated, it could not work. And in this context, as you know, the negative moment is that all trilateral infrastructure projects has been stopped recently, you know, about between Russia, North Korea, and South Korea, as a result of problems with DPRK and the strong reaction of the world community, and particularly of Seoul. Now all these projects are stopped. And of course, it's of particular concern for Moscow because Moscow was interested to participate in them. And of course, it's a big blow to NAPC process, as I think. And I agree with other speakers that this is important issue that should be addressed first of all for this process to go ahead. As far as Russia, we are making our own turn to the east and developing the Russian Far East. And of course, this is more important. Maybe economic development is more important. And recently, we have a Far Eastern Economic Forum. Maybe you've heard in September, which has been attended by 3 leaders: President Putin, Prime Minister Abe, and President Park Geun-hye. So they all discussed problems for development of the Russian Far East. And for example, Mr. Putin offered several projects to form broad Eurasian integration space that correspond very well with soft security issues in Northeast Asia. Firstly, to form a reliable regional energy infrastructure. It's the idea to construct the energy supergrid connected all Northeast Asia countries. Not a new idea, but now it's kind of promoted to more high level. Also, he offered to form a joint digital economic space in Northeast Asia in such spheres as transport, foreign trade, customs, service. And finally, invited foreign partners to help in formation of international science, education, and technology cluster at the Russian island, a venue of the newly formed Far Eastern Federal University that I represent here today. Again, speaking about soft security issues, I just want to make a citation from a speech of Russian Deputy Minister Antonov, who made this in June this year. He was speaking, addressed the Russia-ASEAN dialogue. And his idea was that Russia is ready to give input for international cooperation in such areas like fighting international terrorism, support of maritime security, close interaction in management of natural disasters and overcoming consequences of technogenic catastrophes, developing cooperation in military, medicine, and others. So, though he was addressing ASEAN summit, I think ideas are very relevant with what Russia could do in cooperation with Northeast Asia countries. So, what kind of, if speaking about 3 sessions that will follow after today, after the plenary session, I think Russia has a good potential to contribute. We have 2 very serious governmental structures, such as Rosatom. It is a big ministry which have a full cycle of producing nuclear reactors and teach personnel, and we have good experience already with doing this in China and in Vietnam. As far as Ministry of Emergency Situations, it also has very strong reputation. It has been started by Mr. Shoigu, if you know, very effective person, and now Minister of Defense. So it's really a ministry with great potential. The problem is sometimes there is not enough trust. For example, we're trying to help Japan to help with this, the year 2011, with this catastrophe. Still, it was not very easy to do because it was lack of trust, and finally, Japan asked United States to help, and Russia was not, couldn't do much. Anyway, so this is what I already said. Our contribution mostly is in energy security, nuclear security with Rosatom, and all disasters management with Ministry of Emergency Situations. And as far as hard security and confidence building measures, of course, Russia follow all this cooperation in all these areas. And for example, when we are arranging exercises, I think we would, our idea is to have more multilateral exercise like RIMPAC, but invite us not only American allies, but also such countries like China and Russia. And so far, this experience has been controversial in this area. And another effective step in this area is to decrease the level of American and South Korean exercises in the vicinity of the Korean Peninsula, not to directly provoke DPRK. I think it's very reasonable advice. Thank you. Thank you.
Stand up, please.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. The six-party talks, as we know, the only official multilateral mechanism of security cooperation in the region, which is not resumed and cannot deal effectively with the North Korean nuclear issues. North Korea, as they point out, marked steps toward a nuclear weapon state, both in name and reality. and consistently maintains its nuclear deterrence. According to some predictions, by 2020, North Korea could have up to 100 nuclear weapons. So the question is how this scenario will impact on the six-party talks process. North Korea has offered to return to the six-party talks without preconditions to discuss regional security topics, such as nuclear disarmament and other issues, but not denuclearization. So Pyongyang points out that North Korea faces military nuclear threats from the United States, but at the same time it wants to sign a formal peace treaty with Washington. North Korea has long worked for it, and from Pyongyang's perspective, a peace treaty could be a way toward resolving the nuclear issue in the Korean Peninsula. From the United States perspective, many scholars argue that the United States approach to Pyongyang's WMD program, so-called strategic patience, has not achieved a concrete progress and has been ineffective in dealing with North Korea's nuclear program. Especially some experts assess that the US should take a relatively hard approach to North Korea. At the same time, engage North Korea to the dialogue. In other words, it has become the time to rethink North Korea's strategy. China scholars say China should make more efforts to impose real sanctions on North Korea. China and the United States can work together effectively on North Korea, then it would be a meaningful step toward building, as Chinese scholars say, a new type of major power relations. In fact, China supported the UN Security Council Resolution 2270, which imposed unprecedented sanctions on North Korea. At the same time, it has warned the United States against deploying the THAAD system in South Korea, which could lead to the weakening of implementation of the resolution by one of main states whose participation is essential. So from the realistic perspective, even China and the United States have reached a consensus on the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula based on building a new type of major power relations. It's too early to expect that the six-party talks will resume soon. Also, the United States sanctions against North Korea have a negative impact on its economy, but still no guarantee that Pyongyang will ever give up the nuclear weapons. And its negatively impact not only on regional stability, but also lead the interest to some countries such as South Korea to develop its own nuclear weapons program. Of course, it's still difficult to identify North Korea's interest in multilateral security mechanism because it still shows unpositive interest in the multilateral security framework, including the six-party talks. However, North Korea joined the ASEAN Regional Forum, RF, in 2000, and it rejected to participate on NAPSI Forum, initiated by South Korea. But Pyongyang is annually sending the delegates to Ulaanbaatar dialogue, initiated by Mongolia. So unlike many countries in the region, Mongolia has good relations with all countries in the region, including both North and South Korea. As a state with international recognized nuclear weapon-free state, Ulaanbaatar has become a good third country location in which countries could meet dialogue. So to conclude, the general judgment for the security situation in Northeast Asia is as follows. First, the current security climate in the region clearly demonstrates that the political integration in the region is still relatively limited. In the short term, it's unrealistic to expect that six-party talks will resume, because in the highly polarized environment of Northeast Asia, any actions or policies that takes place in one country have a significant impact on the others. So different perception and understanding about its security environment and its national security priorities could lead major countries to compromise and conflict in the region. So the security situation has seen no change. Second, As growing North Korean nuclear threat, there is a clear need to include the denuclearization issue under the consultation between the parties. So parties' role in managing North Korean nuclear issues, such as bringing back the denuclearization issue to the negotiation table and prevent the possibility of an arms race in the Korean Peninsula, is still one of the main indicators of its international behavior in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Friedrich.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. We'd like to thank the government of Korea and the CSIS for inviting the OSCE and myself to participate in the high-level governmental meeting and the NAPSI forum today. And also I think it's excellent that this is taking place here, this prestigious CSIS think tank organization, which has, of course, a worldwide renown. Ambassador Shin already referred to the Helsinki Principles and the OSCE, and I would like not to go too much into this, but of course we know today that we have to be very careful when we talk about model character with regard to Europe. That's because sadly Europe is today in a crisis, and but still I think the important lessons can be learned from the construction of the OSCE, the CSE first, and then the institutionalization of the process to become the OSCE. So I think in view of the crisis in Europe, but also the crisis in Asia, I think I'd like to ask a few questions which may be able to drive the agenda, which is driving the agenda of the OSCE, but also the one of NAPSI as well. First, how do we deal with an uncertain and dynamic security environment that is influenced by new types of conflicts due to new technology and hybrid strategy that includes the use of misinformation and propaganda? How to deal with cybersecurity, non-state actors, radical nationalism, violent extremism, and international terrorism? How do we deal with military brinkmanship, unfortunately, which has come back after the end of the Cold War, that disturbingly happens in the shadow of nuclear weapons? We heard that already earlier today. How do we deal with disputed history and disputed narratives, or narratives that are contested both in Europe and in Asia? Ambassador Shin referred to the exclusive identity issue. I think here this is an important question to tackle. And finally, do we share common values, or is cooperation today based on common interests only? Or in other words, should we aspire to create a community of common values, or rather be more pragmatic and more realistic in working on functional issues? With this, the OSCE is actually today trying to return to military stability in Europe, making efforts on this, reducing hostility and creating military predictability. There was just a meeting on Monday which dealt with two initiatives, a German and an American initiative, to, on the one hand, to return back to military stability in Europe, to avoid what happened already, that a Russian fighter plane was shot down by another member of the OSCE, by Turkey, to make sure that bilateral, multilateral agreements and military-to-military cooperation can prevent such hazard incidents from happening in the future. And the second initiative has been to relaunch conventional arms control in view of the danger of a new arms race in Europe and the changing nature of armed conflicts and the emergence of new technologies. In this context, it has been proposed to engage in joint risk and threat assessments, to improve verification and monitoring capabilities of the Vienna Document and Open Skies Treaty, and also to look at how much confidence-building measures and arms control could be applied in disputed territorial areas and zone of protracted conflicts, basically to use a status-neutral approach to CBMs and arms control. We already heard what the requirements are for all this multilateral cooperation to succeed. I'd just like to mention two or three. It's, of course, we need a political commitment by all parties. We need the inclusiveness of small and big states together, and civil society as well, but also, to be pragmatic, legally non-binding agreements at that stage. Finally, the OSCE tries also to engage with Asian partners on these issues, particularly confidence-building measures, empowerment, inclusion of women in the political economic process, and more recently also on creating equal opportunities for women and men to contribute to peace processes, topics which were debated at the Bangkok annual meeting of the partnership group. And also the use of civil society organizations. Ambassador Shin referred to the OSCE network of think tanks and academic institutions. We had a very good meeting in this beautiful palace, Coburg Palace in Vienna, on NAPSI, which helped to bring this NAPSI issue also into the OSCE community. Finally, the engagement of Asian countries in the OSCE in operational issues, such as the involvement in the support of the Border Management Security College in Dushanbe, which has a lot of Afghan participants as well, and the involvement financially, but even in terms of personnel of Asian countries with regard to special monitoring mission in Ukraine. With this, I'd like to stop here. Thank you very much.
Well, it's my pleasure to be at this NAPSI forum for the third time here, so apart from the beginning. But if I think back what has happened since we met last time in Seoul last year, then I think the regional landscape has changed negatively. I don't have to recall the various nuclear and missiles tests, but also positively, because the trilateral cooperation which was referred to between Japan, Korea and China has picked up also on the ministerial level. I would also like to add that Asia and Northeast Asia remains high on the radar screen of the European Union. We have just published a major policy paper, the Global Strategy for the European Union's Foreign and Security Policy, and I quote, "There's a direct connection between European prosperity and Asian security. In light of the economic weight that Asia represents for the EU and vice versa, peace and stability in Asia are a prerequisite for our prosperity. We will deepen economic diplomacy and scale up our security role in Asia." End of quote. So that is the work program of the European Union for the next 5 years. The strategy also lists achieving cooperative regional orders as one of the 5 priorities of the EU's external actions. The others are security of the Union, state and resilience of state and societies, an integrated approach to conflicts, and global governance for the 21st century. And I think based on the EU's experience of voluntary regional governance, I underline voluntary because if you want to leave, you can leave, as you all know, is a fundamental rationale for the EU's own peace and development in the 21st century, and therefore it's also part of the strategy to say that the EU will promote and support cooperative regional orders worldwide, including in the most divided areas. And the most divided areas, unfortunately, the Korean Peninsula comes to mind, which includes, of course, the concept also of non-proliferation. Therefore, the EU will not strive to export its model threat, don't worry, but rather seek reciprocal inspiration from different regional experiences. Cooperative regional orders comprise a mix of bilateral, sub-regional, regional, and interregional relations. They also feature the role of global players, interlinked with regionally owned cooperative efforts. Taken together, these can address transnational conflicts, challenges, and opportunities. Well, that's the policy language, and I think now we have to see that we can apply it. And therefore, we would like to see that NAPSI fits into this concept of creating a cooperative regional orders. Then That's also necessary, I think, because we have to move now at once beyond seminars. And I think we have to have more focus, as it was mentioned, in order to make sure that there is a future beyond the change of governments and administrations. However, we have to see that we have this interlinked approach between bilateral, regional. And I think this is one of the main issues, and we all have experience. We have experience in the Asia-Europe meeting. We have experience in APEC, and I have already referred to the trilateral cooperation. I think if NAPSI were able to provide a sort of long-term vision in bringing these elements together, I think this is one of the areas where I would see future. Because NAPSI needs sustainability and what we would say now, resilience. And therefore, holding the forum here in the United States for the first time, getting the buy-in of others, I think is essential, and I'm very happy that what we have discussed a year ago actually has been realized. But we also need then the buy-in of societies, of the civil society. And I think this is the important role of the forum, in addition to the government-to-government meetings, which we will have in the afternoon. This NAPSI network of think tanks, I think, could be a useful exercise, and the European Institute of Strategic Studies has already talked with in Korea, and I think they are ready to cooperate. And I think they could also perhaps help to give a better name recognition to NAPSI, because hardly anybody knows NAPSI. I think if we go out here in the streets, we will not see too many who know it. So I think that's also something we have to work on. Last but not least, I think maintaining a sort of critical engagement and cooperation in combination with confidence-building measures could help in addressing the root causes of conflicts and contribute to a solution. Therefore, in the past interventions, we have already referred to our experience, which we have. And I think we also have to see that we keep up these lines of communication with this critical engagement, which I mentioned, while participating in the sanctions. Just yesterday, in the margins of the huge conference on Afghanistan, which took place in Brussels, there was a meeting between the High Representative and the Korean Minister of Foreign Affairs, where it was confirmed that we have to work on sanctions, but we also have to see that we keep the house open. Therefore, trust building is a long-term project necessitating patience, and I think it's worth the effort when considering the alternative of more tensions with the potential of spiraling out of control. The EU with its partners has worked for years patiently with Iran, overcoming many ups and downs before a deal was reached, which now needs implementation. Let's take that as an encouraging example for a situation which looked very bleak and where we found a solution. And I think we should perhaps also think if we can apply something useful to Northeast Asia, and if NAPSI can play a useful role in that endeavor, which would be in our common interest.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of the presenters for very clear and concise comments, and also for staying generally within the time limit, which will give us a lot more time here for Q&A discussions. We have about 50 minutes or so. I'm going to ask the first round of questions myself, and then at some point we'll open it up for questions from the audience itself. But let me start with Sung Han, because you talked about NAPSI's focus thus far on soft security issues, and this, of course, building cooperation, a sense of cooperation in discussing soft security issues, one can argue opens the door for greater cooperation on the harder issues later. Some can also argue, however, that at some point it becomes a diversion, because without getting to the hard security issues, all of this discussion on soft security may just be a distraction. So at what point do you need to move forward? What are the types of things that you see as the hard security issues that NAPSI could work on to sort of move the process forward? I'll give you about 3 minutes, since it's an easy question.
That is not an easy question. Even though I, pointed out NAPSI was started with the soft security issues, but that doesn't necessarily mean soft security issues are easier to deal with, and come up with the tangible results. Ralph, you just mentioned the diversion between soft security discussions on the one hand and hard security discussions or approaches on the other. One thing to prevent this kind of a diversion is to focus on kind of a less sensitive functional issues such as disaster management. Rather than dealing with all kinds of soft security issues one by one, which is okay, but we have to come up with really kind of a flagship agenda, which is less subjective to political and strategic environment of Northeast Asia. I think that is a disaster management issue, because that is less, likely to be politicized. So if we come up with some sort of breakthrough or really dramatic, kind of a progress on that issue, I think that is one of the ways to prevent the diversion between soft and hard security issues.
Victor, you mentioned one of the bigger dilemmas is who leads in the role of a middle power who might be more acceptable to the major powers. Setting aside the old joke about the problem with being a bridge between two powers is that when you're a bridge, both sides walk on you. There's a point that I think South Korea can and has played a useful role in some areas, but the biggest challenge, as you noted, was North Korea. And that's the area where South Korea is probably the least acceptable interlocutor, at least from the terms of the North. So how do you deal with that? Does that mean that NAPSI is not equipped to deal with North Korea? Do we need a different structure or a different leader for that particular challenge?
So, at the risk of saying something that might be blasphemous for a NAPSI gathering, from my observations of NAPSI over the last 3 years, to me the greatest contribution that it can make to resolution of the North Korean security threat on the peninsula is actually is not to address it. That NAPSI's greatest contribution is through focusing on these other functional issues of cooperation to, again, as I said, build sort of habits of dialogue, practices of consultation, among countries in a region of the world where we don't have any sort of extant institutions of any sort when it comes to almost any sort of security issue. Now that's obviously changed with things like TCS and other things, but even there, the more that we can create organizations like this, institutions like this, that really focus on trying to forge cooperation on these other issues, you then start building the infrastructure for a discussion on North Korea. So that's the first point. The second is that I think as NAPSI moves forward, I really do believe that there should be, I mean, for example, Ralph, you run for the United States CSCAP, right? And this is a Track 2 dialogue that has been very successful over the years. NAPSI has to think about transforming itself because it can do an annual meeting that is Track 1 and Track 2, but it needs to have more of a presence And I think, especially since the sponsoring administration in Seoul will no longer be there next year, and we don't know whether the next administration in Korea will continue to pursue this with the same enthusiasm. And so it's in that Track 2 formula that I think there are opportunities for North Korean participation, just as I assume there are in CSCAP as well, that they don't, I don't know if they participate in CSCAP, but
North Korea fully participates.
they fully participate in CSCAP, yeah. So I think, you know, that is another way of doing it, but I don't think NAPSI serves its own purposes well, or the nuclear issue well, by trying to, in some fashion, directly address the nuclear problem.
Yoshi, thank you, first of all, for talking about one of the specific issues, and I think a very important specific issue, which has been South Korea-Japan cooperation. And there has, in fact, been, I think, some positive steps in that direction, although I think everyone still understands we're sort of walking on eggshells in that area. You've been involved in some of the Pacific Forum dialogues that we have had, bringing our Japanese and Korean colleagues together. And when you bring security elite together, there are two things that they all agree on. Number one, both Koreans and Japanese fully agree that cooperation is essential for each other's national security, and that within that context, GSOMIA and AXA, the intelligence sharing and the acquisition sharing, are critical aspects of it. That's the first thing they agree on. The second thing they seem to agree on is that the ball is in the other guy's court. And that is where the dilemma has been. So do you think that it is possible, politically feasible, that Japan can take some type of initiatives to move this forward? Or from your view, is the GSOMIA and AXA ball fully in South Korea's court?
That's a very easy question. Well, I think it depends. And well, it's easy to say on both sides that ball is on the other's court, and but I'm not sure whether they really believe in that when they say that. At least it's mutual. Should be a mutual process, and I think those who agree on those critical issues, both of them, I think, have their sort of if not really enemies, but obstacles on their own home grounds, and you have to always be ready for, receiving friendly fires if you try to move ahead. And so saying that, you have to move first is in a way I don't know, consciously or unconsciously to protect yourself from friendly fires at home. And then how to move ahead? I think this is I'm calling for something impossible, perhaps. I mean, those who are ready to fire at home, friendly fires, I mean, in a way, they have to change. But changing them is perhaps the most difficult part of this, mutual processes of realizing what they agree to be core interest for both of them, in actual policy making process, and so I think that's the current situation, and how to get out of that, I really don't know. But overall, long-term process, I think is moving in the right direction. I mean, between Japan and South Korea, to compare to 20 years ago. I think we have come a long way, and so I think future should be brighter than darker, and we have several critical agreements. In the 90s we had a lot, including history problems, And last year's agreement on comfort women issue between the two governments, it's of course not complete, but that should be the foundation upon which to move forward rather than to move backward. And, but of course, we have both dynamisms. And so we have to do homework, perhaps. Both sides would have to do homework first before trying to talk to each other.
Thank you. I've saved the easiest question for my good friend. Getting out your telescope. There is, I think, a growing view, and one that I'm close to sharing myself. I haven't quite got there, but I'm getting close, that it is actually impossible to make any breakthroughs with the current North Korean government, that they are bound and determined to keep nuclear weapons, to move in that direction, and that in fact, the double-edged sword of economic cooperation is that a North Korea that is more stronger economically, that still has nuclear weapons, is even a bigger threat than the North Korea today, where the economics has some sort of leverage. So I'm just curious if, from your personal opinion, I won't ask you to speak for 1.4 billion Chinese, but from your personal view, is there a point at which you reach the conclusion that only regime collapse or regime change can solve the problem with North Korea, that negotiation is not going to be possible? And what would be the signs that we have reached that point?
Thank you, Ralph. I personally visited North Korea several times. I think diplomacy or negotiation actually worked for a couple of years in 1990s. So a lot of misunderstandings on North Korea, and I think at least the young Kim, baby Kim, is kind of a. I think both South Korea and North Korea have this kind of a sense of unsecure, and also have a sense of being humiliated by the other country. So that is something different. I visited Israel and Palestinian, but I feel Israeli never feel that how Palestinians feel. They are being humiliated by the Israeli government, and Palestinians never have that kind of sense. Think about how Israel feel unsafe, in the modern world. So that's probably one of my observations. A second point I would like to make, I think. Probably, if you don't want to have a direct dialogue, the United States doesn't want to have a direct dialogue, or see dialogue as a bonus to North Korea. So probably you have to take CSIS. In about 3 to 5 years, North Korea will have these kind of nuclear weapons, and they will continue to the missile launch. So if the United States, you have to think about how to live with a nuclear North Korea state. And the problem is whether China is willing to accept that fact, and whether China wants to see North Korea as a nuclear state. And so the problem is for China have a lot of options. You can revoke the 1961 treaties. You can close the border. You can stop the supply oil and stop the import, the coal, this kind of thing. But North Korea, I think, the regime still can buy this kind of thing from Russia, from other countries. So I think the tough choice for China, and also tough choice for the United States, in addition to the joint military drill with South Korea. What other options the United States think about, consider? So I think some people in China propose change the leader, be ready to work on with the contingency plan with the United States, but this is only theoretical debate. I think that China is not ready to do that. And you see the last May, a couple of months ago, Xi Jinping signed a telegram to North Korean leaders and congratulated him to be elected. And Madame Park urged the North Koreans to flee, to leave their country. And I don't see any other policy statements by the United States done by the United States. So.
Thank you. Sergey, you also talked about the Korean Peninsula, and one of the big issues right now that Russia has weighed in on, somewhat surprisingly in my view, has been on the issue of THAAD. I understand why the Chinese object to THAAD. I think the facts on the ground should allay Chinese concerns, but at least there's a discussion there regarding China's second strike capability and survivability of its forces. But it comes somewhat as a surprise that the Russians have come in so strongly on THAAD. Some believe that this may be just a matter of Mr. Putin trying to be mischievous and trying to give the U.S. a hard time in Asia because of us giving Russia a hard time in Europe, et cetera, et cetera. But on the flip side of that, the positive side of that is what types of things, what types of confidence-building measures, if you would allay Russian fears of THAAD and sort of remove Russia from that equation?
Okay, thank you for the difficult question, as I think. Yes, well, of course, for THAAD system, is not such a big threat for Russia as to China, of course, because Russian ballistic missiles are more or less very far from this part, maybe only in Kamchatka, some submarines, but still, and in Siberia. But anyway, yeah, for us it's more symbolic issue, but still we think that if THAAD it looks like it would be activated, it will, as a result, it will be a part of global system of air defense system that will be threatening China and Russia, and in a way we support Chinese position in this context strongly. But again, I agree that still we should consider into account the whole world situation, that there are anti-Russian economic sanctions are enforced. And of course, we are taking this position into account. And as I didn't speak about it much, but in fact, even in the development of the Russian Far East, American position changed seriously from support in the 90s to neutral position like 10, 15 years ago, and a strong contradiction now, yeah, because American diplomats trying to press South Korea and Japan not to participate actively. And so, in fact, it's considered a very serious diplomatic victory of Putin when he arranged this summit in Vladivostok with all these leaders' participation. So they kind of follow this. So for us, I think maybe the best would be if United States would continue or resume some kind of cooperation for us, not only in security, but also in economics. Because as you know, America lost all its share of trade with the Russian Far East. America had maybe 20, 25% 15 years ago, 2 or 3% now, only Exxon oil in Sakhalin, nothing else. Yeah, it's all lost. So this is the case. And if we have no economic cooperation, then it's no trust. And I think it depends, in a way, our position.
Hambot, I think I agree with you when you point out that the prospects for six-party talks right now are pretty slim, particularly if the objective is denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula. And you said there's a need to rethink North Korea strategy. You also mentioned that Mongolia is one of the few countries that has good relations with both the North and the South. how can Mongolia provide its good offices, if you would? Do you think there's a role to play, and do you think the North and South would both accept some honest broker role by Ulaanbaatar?
In the region, the Mongolian location is quite unique. We don't have a direct border with the countries of the region except two neighbors. Second, the history of Mongolia of 20th century, Mongolia was very hard politicized, swinging between two neighbors. And just recently, after the 90s, we became democratic and became close to democratic countries with human rights basics. That's why we, as one of our scholars said, that North Korea is our past, but South Korea is our future. So like between two, we will bring the example of two Koreas. So this kind of quite unique allows us to be more close to the countries, to both Koreans. And of course, we have some critics from some scholars that Mongolia is a democratic country and with human rights constitutional value. So we should be more hard to North Korea, to be more close to other countries. But because of the situation of Mongolian current situation, we try to be more open for all participants. And that's why, for instance, when we organize a kind of forum, symposiums, meetings of Northeast, including Northeast Asian countries, North Korea also participates. That we see that is one sign of to somehow to support the idea of confidence building mechanism. And as you know, that during the CSCAP meeting last year, the quite high positioned representatives from both countries, they came.
Speak into the mic.
They came together, and as we can see that they can sit together and just talking between them. And that's why we see, if you look at the countries in the region, Mongolia can, and maybe we, as we understand that we should play more role in trust building, confidence building, especially between the two Koreas. So, and that's why Ulaanbaatar dialogue initiated by President of Mongolia is focused on the full name of his initiative is Ulaanbaatar Dialogue on Northeast Asian Security and Cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and Frederick, if I stop. All right. If I can, you actually asked a number of very good questions in the course of your presentation, and I won't ask you to answer all of your questions, but I wonder if it's very clear we haven't discussed too much other than in the Japan-Korea context, but certainly disputed history is a big challenge to overcome here in Northeast Asia. Are there lessons learned from the OECD that you think could apply to how we can better deal with those issues in Asia?
Yes, thank you, Ralph. Because of the problems we had in Europe since 2014, actually it was the Swiss chairmanship of the OSCE launched a panel of eminent persons on European security to see what needs to be done to create the conditions for re-engagement among all the participating states. And we had members, actually from the United States. It was Ambassador Ivo Alder, who was former ambassador to NATO. We had Mr. Karaganov from Russia, etc. And also persons from Central Asia, Caucasus, and Europe at large. And the interesting thing is, when this panel started to meet, that actually there has been a very strong difference of what happened over the last 25 years, since the end of the Cold War. And there were not just two narratives. A Russian narrative, which there was some kind of historic grievance about that actually after the end of the Cold War it was neglected, and of course then you had the missile defense issue, you had Kosovo, etc. But also Western narrative as well of Europe whole and free, and but then there was even a third narrative which came out of we refer to countries in between who were felt like they could not really subscribe to either narrative, and they were afraid that once the chips are down, the US may actually go ahead with a bilateral deal with Russia over their interests. And so these three narratives really gave then the occasion of a study group which exists today of the OSCE network, which already Ambassador Shin has referred to. They have now a study group made up by a number of think tanks to look how to address this contested history contested. And the first report will come out in December of this year. It will be submitted to Ministerial Council meeting of the OSCE. And I think that's really the key, is dialogue. If it's not possible among states, start on think tank level, but make sure it's going to be fed into the more formal process at a certain stage. So I think that's certainly one important area to look at. There's also a process, I think the UN picked it up, referred to as dealing with the past, which comes from civil wars and overcome grievances. So I think we can fall back on a number of these lessons there. But secondly, also the key is really to share and have a continued dialogue on threats, threat perceptions. Which we realized again at OSCE just earlier this week when I mentioned we had Russia there, we had United States and many other countries. We have to share what the threats are. And that not just in a political context, but also the militaries have to be there. Military to military, again, civil society, and try to bring it up then eventually into some kind of process which can take advantage of that. Thank you.
And Michael, very briefly, if I could ask a somewhat similar question to you, and that's, right now we see the EU under some challenges as far as it's keeping together. What do you see are the kind of forces that provide the greatest challenge to multilateral cooperation among a group of diverse nations, even with common interests?
Well, I think what we are all experiencing, whether in Asia or in Europe or in the US right now, is a certain reaction against globalization. And that leads, unfortunately, to completely the wrong recipe. Instead of more cooperation to overcome problems which we have recognized that they need cooperation, we have a certain tendency to nationalization or even renationalization. We do have some success stories. It was mentioned the climate change. 2 days ago, the European Parliament has also ratified, and therefore now it can enter into force. So there are some positive elements, but especially in geopolitics, which we start to talk again, I think is the clear indication that we are going backwards. And I think the effort which we have to make, and I think that's something we are trying to do, is one has to collect back with the positive experience which we have made. And for some reason, it's not taken into consideration anymore. It seems to be the thing of the past. But I think this positive experience, like overcoming tensions between former enemies, that has become the issue of today again. And it's not something which we just should have in history books, but we need it now again. And I think that's the challenge. And there are positive examples in Europe, but there are also positive examples in Asia. I also have referred to this very difficult process we have gone through with Iran. So international cooperation, mediation can do a job and can be successful, but we have to recall in the present situation a little bit the positive examples in order to avoid that we are backtracking.
Thank you. We have about 20 minutes left. I want to open the floor for your questions. I would ask you to identify yourself and to not make your question longer than their presentations. I see. Here, please. I'm going to take a series of questions, and then we'll come back to the presenters.
I'm Peter Humphrey, Intel analyst and a former diplomat. I'm wondering if NAPSI could take on the issue of island disputes. For example, in the to move away from this winner-take-all mentality that seems to prevail. For example, in the Dokdo Takashima case, would it be possible to give the rocks to Korea and the fishing rights and mineral rights to Japan, or somehow split the difference on fishing and mineral rights? And with a successful precedent, could NAPSI then move on to, for example, the Senkaku Islands, and maybe even look at the Kurils someday?
Good. Good. Very good question. Thank you. Yes, this gentleman here, and then here.
Michael Marshall, Global Peace Foundation. Question is for Professor Soya. At the beginning of your remarks, you said that the overall reaction to NAPSI within Japan was negative. Could you tell us the major reasons for that assessment?
Good. This gentleman
yes,
here.
Thank you. I'm Koji Suzuki. I'll be the chair of the disaster risk reduction session in the afternoon, and I'm asking you to Mr. Dr. Sergey about the opportunities for collaborative operation in emerging situations. I think I have a lot of opportunities for collaboration between the NAPSI region in rehabilitation, recovery, and preparedness for disaster risk reduction. But in case of emergency operations, provided it is done by the militaries, it is very difficult to make a collaborative operation in the countries. It is necessary, before that, trust building, and after that, collaborative operation by the military in the region. How do you think of that?
Good. Thank you. This young lady over here. And then this gentleman behind her afterwards. But yes, right here.
Hi, my name is Jaewon. I'm a PhD student at Georgetown University. And while I don't claim to be an expert in conflict and peace studies, I want to take this opportunity to ask some easy question as well. So I guess my question is, I see there's a gap in vocalness between the domestic coalitions. So Professor Soya was mentioning that when state-level cooperation tends to occur, then it provokes sort of an opposition from the nationalistic-oriented domestic audiences in both South Korea and Japan. And it was interesting to me that when those state levels sort of escalate the tension politically, then there's no discernible domestic groups that call for cooperation. But when the two states do try to cooperate, then there's a very vocal and quite eager opposition against that. So how can we sort of empower the pro-cooperation domestic coalition?
Good, thank you. Gentleman here.
Hi, my name is Myung Park from International Law Institute. As we mentioned, the Northeast Asia peace and cooperation today, it is reasonable to think about North Korean refugees after the collapse of the North Korean regime. What are the NAPSI's plan and preparation for the North Korean refugees after the collapse of the North Korean regime? Thank you.
Good. And then this gentleman right here will get the last.
Jae-Pong Ru is my name, of One Korea Foundation. This question is generally for the panel. The NAPSI was formed apparently for peace and cooperation in Northeast Asia. And yet it assumed itself a position of a second track, solved the security issues, and so on, mild and more ad hoc approaches, and so on. In my view, peace and cooperation of Northeast Asia is not possible without unification, and so long as division continues. And yet I recognize that NAPSI kind of placed that in another group's objective, not its own. But it could perhaps make some move, though, since every country would be interested in peace and cooperation in Northeast Asia. If Korea, when and if Korea is united, what kind of united Korea do they want? They can kind of draw a picture together. And then they could perhaps urge two important countries for Korean unification, that is China and the United States, to talk until they find a solution. You can press them. You don't have to come up with an answer yourself. In the meantime, in a leisure time, you can talk about other minor issues. On the other hand, the kind of issues you talk about, disaster management, nuclear safety issues, they're all related to unification anyway. Thank you.
Very much. At this point, I'm going to start in reverse order, and I'll just give each of the panelists an opportunity to make some closing comments and address questions that were addressed to them, including their vision of what a unified Korea would look like and how that would play. So, Michael, let me start with you, please.
Well, just to remind you, when there was the unification of Germany, there was not a single textbook you could take off the shelf and say, well, that's the way we do it. And I think in politics and diplomacy, we will always face the situation. We are having it now. We all know our Article 50, but that's all we know. So we have to address it. And I think there is no recipe for the unification of Korea. But I think what will be important, and I was at another meeting in Switzerland with the participation of North Korea. One also has to address the issues which are brought forward. What we heard there was, well, we have studied the situation in Libya, we have studied the situation in Iraq, and this is not going to happen to us. So I think these are issues which need an answer, and this is an answer you have to find primarily regionally. There was also the issue of guarantees. And there was, I even heard the argument from North Korean colleagues there, we cannot accept the guarantee by China because China is subscribing to the non-first use of nuclear weapons. So there is a security dilemma. And in international politics, we have a lot of books written on security dilemmas, but we have very few case studies on how to apply it. And I think there is a big chunk of work to be done regionally, but at the same time, and therefore we are sitting here and talking about Northeast Asia, is security has become indivisible. And I have started my words with that. So therefore, there's an interest in Europe, and we have engaged in KEDO 25 years ago. That was my first contact with the situation, and it was about energy. And I think today we are still talking about energy as an important element. And in the discussion which is going on in New York right now, it's about energy. So I think there are areas where we probably have to think more and develop regional solutions, because the problem has to be solved here, but it has global implications. And we should not fall into the trap in which we see now very often with populistic approaches in politics, national politics and international politics. The simple solution is normally not the solution. It's just creating another problem, and that we should be aware of.
Yeah, and perhaps not on behalf of the OSCE, but more personal, referring to the track 2, which I think you have been involved as well, Ralph, on the Zermatt process in Montreux, which brings together North and South Koreans and other parties is essential exactly to test the water, how far it can go, and where are the limits. I think there are quite a few other track 2 activities. And the other thing is training. I think training, capacity building of North Koreans actually happening in Geneva, the Geneva Center Security Policy, which I used to run, actually even together with South Korean officers as well, is essential to create some kind of contacts, and eventually, over a long time, it's an investment. Capacity building is an investment which goes well beyond skills. It's a political process too. Thank you.
Yeah, among the problems, the challenges across the globe, Korean Peninsula issue became maybe less important. Less important, but anyway, we live in the region, so we have to pay attention on that. And one way, maybe, we know that all of us know that the Korean Peninsula issue is a consequence of Cold War. So main players are still them, and compared with 10, 15 years ago, the situation become worse then. And so maybe one way, as I try to talk about the multinational literalism, including other countries of the region. And we have to learn more, maybe, the lesson from Helsinki to deal with the issue.
Thank you. Sergey. Okay, I think we don't have much time, so just again about North Korean Peninsula, I think, issue. Of course, for Russia considered this threat as very seriously, and all these missiles launched and nuclear explosions. Vladivostok is the nearest city to this place where it all started, so we really consider it as a serious threat. Yes, and on the other hand, Russia always says that we should not press North Korea too hard, kind of give them some space for development and to accept some changes. So in other words, Russia is one of the countries which really support an idea and the plan and the whole project of future North joint united Korea, because only in this case, our Northeast Asia will become a united region, and all this trilateral project would go ahead with connection of railroads and all these oil and gas pipelines, and so it really will be another picture. The most difficult question, of course, is how it will be done, and this is kind of more, the situation is more difficult, but again, the two Germanys were able to make one state with Russian help, so I think somebody should help, but again, my point that maybe South Korea should be more kind of active, not only ask big powers to help. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we always feel some kind of moral dilemma in dealing with North Korea. For example, you see the recent news talking about the natural disaster in North Korea, but the United States and China doing nothing, haven't provided any food assistance to North Korea. So this is a bad regime. So how can we? But you cannot cut off the relationship with North Korea. So I got sudden message from North Korea and asked me whether the United States and South Korea will use the military drills as excuse to attack them. So I think that's really weird. I told them they are afraid of you. You are launching, probably they're afraid you are launching the first attack. When we met South Korean friends, a couple of years ago, talking about the cost of peaceful unification, right? And talking about how South Korea can play a role like a middle power in a positive image in the international society. But last trip, last year, I visited South Korea, and I find people begin to talk about Assad, talking about strengthened military ties with the United States. So there's a lot of black clouds. The challenge for us, for think tanks, I think we need to turn these black clouds into beautiful rainbows. Thank you.
Yes, I think I have three issues from the floor. The first one is NAPSI and territorial disputes. And I think if I may answer very quickly, I think territorial disputes exist at the exit of NAPSI process rather than the entrance. And if we start from territorial dispute or include this as an important issue in the NAPSI process, then I think this would rather feed into mistrust rather than building trust. I'm afraid that's a reality. And this is partly and maybe largely because, particularly from South Korean perspective, I understand the Dokdo issue is the history issue. And so this, I think, raises another important question, how the history factor plays in this NAPSI process. And I think NAPSI is very important, and because this is basically about cooperation. If I may, I mean, what Northeast Asians should learn from European experiences, for instance, is that in European experiences, I think cooperation came first before dealing with the difficult history issues. You started from cooperation, and you gradually felt like cooperating among former enemies. And then I think that process opened up a process for reconciliation. But in Asia, we tend to argue the other way around. And I think that's one point which NAPSI made something important in terms of dealing with the relationship between cooperation and the difficult history question. And secondly, reasons for Japan's negative views about NAPSI, which I didn't want to talk in this forum. But if I may, I think my observation is, this is not about myself, my observation of those who have somewhat negative views. I think basically there may be two reasons. One is, if I may be honest, some sense of mistrust about South Korea. And so moving the goalpost is a popular a terminology used by those who are skeptical about what South Korea does. And secondly, those Japanese are uniquely realistic, and they tend to look at negative sides rather than positive sides of these international affairs. I think those are the two basic kind of phenomena or things that I noticed as to the arguments about being negative about NAPSI. And the third question is how to empower pro-cooperation people and groups. I think here exchanges, I think that they are the perhaps only kind of way. And this is very productive, as I said at the outset of my presentation. I mean, student exchanges are very, very encouraging. And when they ask questions, they genuinely ask questions because they'd like to know why the other side, believe the way that they do. But it's hard to change old people. When old people ask questions, they have answers. But when young people ask questions, they don't. They really would like to know. And I think, but the level of exchanges between Japanese and South Koreans are not very extensive. One statistic is only 20% of Japanese have been to South Korea. And among my students, that was a little lower. About 50% of them have been to Korea before, but going through these in-depth exchanges with Korean students, many of them realize that it's going to be really possible to cooperate with South Korea. That's the impression that they come away with when after having these experiences. And so continuing this project, I think, is very, very important. And this applies to the Chinese case as well. And many Chinese visitors coming to Japan tend to change their perceptions about Japan. And then this is happening to those who actually come to know the other side.
With respect to dealing with territorial and maritime issues at NAPSI, I think those issues are really somewhat sensitive issues that include both soft and hard aspects of security. If you look at the case of South China Sea or East China Sea, this is not solely maritime issues. It has already transformed itself kind of a strategic issues. So in light of functionalist spirit or functionalism of NAPSI, that is inclined to expect the spillover effect from soft security cooperation toward the hard security cooperation. This is somewhat too sensitive to start with at this juncture. So later on, as I already pointed out, if you come up with some success story at easier issues such as disaster management, then we can move forward to deal with those rather sensitive issues. Secondly, domestic and foreign nexus in dealing with many issues between Korea and Japan. This is like a kind of a two-level game, as you have learned from IR textbook. I think one point I want to emphasize is that this is about public diplomacy between Seoul and Tokyo. For the past 3 years before Comfort Women Agreement, Seoul and Tokyo governments had concentrated their efforts, time and energy on Washington to attract the hearts and minds from the U.S. government and making them support their own kind of judgment and positions. I wouldn't say it was destructive, but it was ill-focused. It was a bit of waste of time, energy. So in that sense, I think the point or hub for public diplomacy between Seoul and Washington should be Seoul and Tokyo rather than Washington, in order to dilute the misunderstandings, in order to expose those domestic ideological rights or ideological nationalists, or whatever you call, expose them to constructive dialogues and conversations. That kind of efforts are needed to fill kind of a missing link of NAPSI, if I may. Lastly, with respect to SAD, how it is related to peaceful Korean unification, I don't think that is contradictory to peaceful unification of Korea in the sense that SAD system is going to be removed when North Korea gives up its nuclear weapons. In other words, the threat from North Korea is removed, then we don't have any reason to continue to deploy SAD systems. So in that sense, I think we don't have to worry too much about the relationship between SAD and its kind of a unintended kind of a repercussions on Chinese and Russian security.
The East Asian region is a region where increasing intra-regional trade and investment has not led to comparable levels of cooperation and trust at the political level, the so-called Asian paradox. And that is where NAPSI can play a very important role in terms of filling this space for functional cooperation. If NAPSI is going to succeed into the future, it's going to require the next Korean government to continue to be proactive about it, and it's going to require proactive support from the United States and China. I'm pretty sure that will come from the United States side, the government. I'm not as sure it's going to come from the Chinese side, given all the other extenuating issues, including THAAD. I conclude by picking up on the point that Yoshi made about the younger generation. I think one of the interesting ideas for NAPSI to think about in the future is when it meets, not just to bring together experts who, as Sung-Han said, have the answers to the questions they're already asking, but to actually bring together a younger NAPSI generation of functional experts who work on issues like disaster management or nuclear safety or public health, to try to help cultivate the next generation of people who have much more open minds than all of us up at this table.
Victor, thank you. That fits nicely into the last comment that I wanted to make. I had a masterful 20-minute summation prepared, but since we're out of time, I'll skip that, other than to reinforce that point. My organization, the Pacific Forum CSIS, has for the past 12 years run a Young Leaders Program where we brought young people in their 20s and early 30s to sit in on the senior level dialogues. At our meeting last year in Ulaanbaatar, for the first time, we had 2 young leaders from North Korea who participated along with their counterparts from South Korea and other countries. And I think, A, that it is critical that we get the next generation involved, and B, those of you who are preparing different events and want next generation, we now have a list of about 1,000 people from 55 different countries, all interested in Asia security, the best and the brightest, and we can help share those with others. So at this point, please join me in thanking our panelists for a very stimulating morning. And Victor, any announcements?
Yes, so that concludes the